Welcome to another episode of Supernatural Tales. Tonight, prepare yourself for a spine-chilling story that took place on the dark and lonely roads of Carbondale, Illinois. We will follow the account of John Carter, an experienced truck driver who, on a fateful night, encountered the enigmatic and terrifying Lady in White. Sit around the campfire and let the dark atmosphere of this frightening tale envelop you. John Carter was a middle-aged man, strong and robust, with years of road experience under his belt. He drove his truck across America's highways, transporting goods from one corner of the country to another. John prided himself on knowing the roads like the back of his hand and was rarely scared by the ghost stories he heard at truck stops. But one night in Carbondale would change his life forever. It was a full moon night in mid-June. The road was deserted, illuminated only by the headlights of John's truck. He had left Springfield earlier, carrying a load of fresh produce destined for Chicago. The trip was going smoothly until, as he approached Carbondale, a thick fog began to form, obscuring his vision. John reduced his speed and continued to drive cautiously. As he drove on, he noticed something peculiar on the side of the road. It was a figure dressed in white, almost ethereal, seemingly floating above the asphalt. At first, he thought it was just a strange reflection or a trick of the fog, but as he got closer, the figure became more defined. It was a young woman, dressed in a long white gown, her dark hair contrasting with the paleness of her skin. Her eyes were large and vacant, fixed on a distant point. John felt a shiver run down his spine, but his first reaction was concern. He stopped the truck a few yards away and got out, calling out to the woman. "Ma'am, are you all right? Do you need help?" John asked, his voice echoing in the silent night. The woman slowly turned to him, her movements graceful, almost like a dance. Without saying a word, she raised a pale hand and pointed into the darkness of the road. John, confused and a bit scared, followed the direction she pointed but saw nothing beyond the dense fog and empty asphalt. Suddenly, the woman began to walk in the opposite direction, entering a small dirt road branching off the main highway. John hesitated for a moment, but something in her expression, a mix of sadness and urgency, compelled him to follow her. He grabbed a flashlight from the truck and started walking behind the woman, keeping a safe distance. The dirt road was narrow and winding, flanked by tall trees whose canopies formed a natural tunnel. The sound of John's footsteps seemed absorbed by the oppressive silence of the forest. The woman kept walking, her feet barely touching the ground, as if she were floating. John felt a knot form in his stomach, but continued to follow her, driven by an uncontrollable curiosity. After a few minutes, they reached a clearing where a small abandoned chapel stood. The building was in ruins, with moss-covered walls and a partially collapsed roof. The woman stopped in front of the chapel, turning to face John once more. Her eyes were filled with a deep and ancient sadness. John approached cautiously. "Why did you bring me here?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. The woman raised her hand again, this time pointing to the interior of the chapel. John, feeling a mixture of fear and curiosity, entered. The interior was dark and damp, with the smell of rotting wood and wet earth. On the altar, he saw something that made his heart stop for a moment, an old framed photograph. The photo showed a young woman dressed as a bride, her face radiant with happiness. Next to her was a young man, both looking immensely happy. John picked up the photograph and, upon turning the frame over, found an inscription, "Mary and Ernest, 1935. John felt a chill run down his spine. He looked towards the chapel entrance and saw the woman in white again. This time, she was crying, her tears streaming silently down her pale cheeks. With a tremendous effort, she finally spoke, her voice a faint whisper. He promised we would return." Confused, John tried to understand what was happening. "What happened to you?" he asked, his voice choked with emotion. The woman told her story, each word laden with pain and sorrow. She was Mary, a young woman who had been engaged to Ernest, a man from the area. On the night of their wedding, as they were heading to the reception, they suffered a terrible accident on the road. Ernest died instantly, but Mary survived only to wander the road where she had lost the love of her life, waiting for him ever since. John felt tears welling up in his eyes as he listened to her story. Mary's pain was palpable, an open wound that had never healed. He promised himself he would do something to help her find peace. "Mary, I will help you find rest," he said, his voice full of compassion. Mary smiled faintly, her expression softening for a moment. She began to fade slowly, like mist dissipating at dawn. Before disappearing completely, she whispered, "Thank you." John stood in the clearing for a long time, reflecting on what had happened. He knew he needed to do something to honor Mary's memory and all those like her, trapped between this world and the next. Back in town, John shared his story with the locals. They were moved, and in a collective effort, they restored the old chapel in memory of Mary and Ernest. A small plaque was placed at the entrance, telling the couple's story and asking visitors to respect the sacred site. John continued his life as a truck driver but never passed through Carbondale without stopping to visit the chapel. He felt that, in some way, he had helped Mary find peace, and in return, she watched over him on the dangerous roads he traveled. And so ends today's tale. I hope you felt the same tension and mystery that John felt that night. Until the next episode of Supernatural Tales, where new haunting stories await to be told. Good night, and remember, sometimes the past is never truly dead, just waiting to be discovered.